All right, let's just jump right in. Welcome to This Explainer, where today we're absolutely stripping down one of the most famous psychological thrillers ever written. Now, when most of us think of Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, what comes to mind? Probably an axe, a gruesome murder, and some seriously crushing guilt, right? But here is the truly fascinating part. This story doesn't actually kick off with a murder. It begins with a mathematical equation, a genuinely chilling one. It begins with the deadly math of rational egoism. Okay, so to really get this math, we have to travel back to a tavern near the Haymarket. This is about 6 weeks before the actual crime even takes place. Picture a young student sitting there with an officer, passionately pitching the ultimate ethical ratio, 1 to 100. He's proposing a trade, one completely useless, absolutely harmful life exchanged for 100 good deeds. Just listen to the cold calculus of this idea. He says, 1 death for 100 lives, it's simple arithmetic. The student is talking specifically about Alyona Ivanovna. She's this sick, spiteful old pawnbroker. She's wealthy, sure, but all her money is destined for a monastery for perpetual prayers. The student is sitting there arguing that she is literally useful to no one, and that her hoarded wealth could be used to save dozens of families from destitution, from ruin, from total corruption. In his words, weighing her life in the balance, she's worth no more than a louse or a cockroach.
But then, we get this absolutely critical detail. The officer listens to this grand, sweeping utilitarian pitch and just asks a very simple question. Would you kill her yourself? And the student instantly replies, of course not, and literally just drops the subject right there to order another drink. It's brilliant, because it perfectly illustrates this massive gap between an abstract intellectual debating exercise and actual real-world bloodshed. Because, for a healthy, normal person, this is just talk. It's a manufactured justification that they are far too psychologically healthy to ever actually put into practice.
But what happens when that exact same justification is left lying around for someone who isn't healthy? Raskolnikov, our protagonist, happens to overhear this exact logic playing out in the tavern. And here is why this is so crucial. The idea isn't even his own invention. Raskolnikov is hearing his own darkest thoughts coming out of a stranger's mouth. He takes this ambient chatter of his generation and reads it as a sign, like some predestined summons telling him to act. It's a terrifying look at how a general cultural mood can tragically harden into an inescapable individual compulsion.
So let's move on to Section 1, the cult of rational egoism. We really need to understand the philosophical water these characters were swimming in. This deadly math wasn't just some straw man argument Dostoevsky slapped together to easily knock down. No, it was the dominant idiom of Russian progressive youth in the 1860s. So what did rational egoism actually claim? Basically, it's the doctrine that morality boils down entirely to enlightened self-interest. The core belief was that man always acts for his own advantage, and the only reason he ever acts badly is because he miscalculates. The promise here was incredibly seductive. The idea was, hey, if you just educate a person to compute their interests properly, virtue is going to follow automatically. You wouldn't need God, you wouldn't need a pesky conscience, you literally just needed better arithmetic.
And this definitely wasn't happening in a vacuum. Dostoevsky was directly engaging with real-world sources that were just wildly influential at the time. You had N.G. Chernyshevsky's novel What Is to Be Done, which was, practically the sacred text of that entire generation. Then you had Benthamite utilitarianism, the whole idea that the best action is whatever creates the most happiness for the most people. And underpinning all of this was physiological materialism, which essentially viewed human beings as little biological calculators whose outputs could be reliably engineered.
Now, Dostoevsky had actually already launched a preemptive strike against this mechanistic view of humanity in his previous work, Notes from Underground. In that book, his narrator totally rails against the logic that twice 2 makes 4, insisting that a human being will deliberately choose their own harm just to prove they aren't merely a piano key playing some pre-written tune. With Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky takes that exact same argument, rips it out of the realm of abstract polemics, and gives it a physical body and a bloody staircase.
Which brings us to Section 2, the bourgeois double versus the doer.
To really put this philosophy to the test, Dostoevsky introduces a character named Luzhin as a point of contrast. On one side, we've got Raskolnikov, the desperate, starving student who takes the math to its literal bloody conclusion. But on the other side, we have Luzhin, who is this middle-aged legal careerist. Luzhin is basically Raskolnikov's bourgeois double. He uses the exact same progressive vocabulary to stay completely respectable while engaging in absolute predation. It is the exact same underlying premise, it's just hitting a totally different nerve.
You have to hear this incredibly smug, self-satisfied pitch he delivers to a sick man in a tiny garret. Luzhin actually says, "Acquire solely for yourself, and you thereby acquire for all." He argues that science dictates you should love yourself before all others. He even mocks the old traditional morality of, tearing your coat in half to share it with someone in need, claiming that economic truth proves that private selfish enterprise is actually what builds the firmest general welfare. But let's look at what his so-called enlightened self-interest actually looks like in practice. He deliberately seeks out a poor, beautiful, educated bride for one reason only, so she will be permanently indebted to him. He's literally trying to build a marriage entirely based on humiliation. And if that's not enough, he later plants a 100-ruble note to frame the innocent Sonya for theft, just to discredit Raskolnikov. This is enlightened self-interest doing exactly what the doctrine claims it cannot do, destroying other people for personal gain. The irony here is so incredibly thick that even Lizaveta, who is this buffoonish young radical who just parrots progressive ideas, even he easily exposes Luzhin's calculated self-interest as a total fraud.
And when Raskolnikov hears Luzhin's slick economic justifications, he delivers this devastating conceptual demolition. He tells Luzhin that if you carry his logic to its ultimate final conclusion, well, it follows that people may be cut up. Raskolnikov instantly recognizes his own philosophical doctrine standing right in front of him, just with the blood laundered out.
All right, moving to section 3, the uncalculated remainder. So, how does Dostoevsky actually go about destroying this utilitarian arithmetic? He does it with the messy, tragic human costs that simply will not fit neatly into a ledger. The equation basically experiences a series of catastrophic, cascading failures. First, there's Lizaveta. She is the pawnbroker's meek, exploited, pregnant half-sister. She is exactly the sort of person those 100 good deeds were supposed to save. But Raskolnikov ends up slaughtering her too when she accidentally walks in on the crime. Absolutely nothing in his math anticipated her. Second, the unspent money. It just gets buried under a stone. It's never counted, never used. Those 100 lives are never saved. The whole calculation is completely voided. And third, the louse test, reversed. Remember how Raskolnikov categorized the pawnbroker as a louse to license the killing? Well, that classification scheme violently turns back on him.
The psychological weight of this realization is utterly crushing. Raskolnikov realizes his own total insignificance. As he later confesses, "I killed a principal, but I didn't step over. I'm a louse like all the rest." He really thought he was this rational superhuman, but instead, he finds himself trapped inside his own degrading category. Then Dostoevsky presents this living, breathing refutation to the radical's math, and that is Sonya. Notice the stark contrast here between her sacrifice and the utilitarian one. Sonya actually does perform a literal act of self-ruin. She sacrifices herself for her family's survival, but it costs her absolutely everything, and it is driven entirely by unquantifiable love, not some cold arithmetic. Dostoevsky places her immense, incalculable sacrifice right next to the rational theory, and he does it without needing to add a single explicit comment. And honestly, it's Sonya's father, Marmeladov, who provides perhaps the most profound answer to the entire doctrine of rational egoism. He says, man needs somewhere to go. He's suggesting that human beings require a spiritual destination, a place for the soul to rest and actually find meaning. We are not merely economic inputs just waiting around for the right calculation. Finally, let's wrap up with section 4, psychology versus logic. Despite all the tragedy we've just unpacked here, Dostoevsky does something incredibly bold as a writer. He never actually proves the mathematically wrong. The completely honest construction of this novel acknowledges that the tavern student was right, on paper. Dostoevsky actually lets the student make a genuinely persuasive case. The argument for sacrificing one harmful life to save 100 is never technically rebutted on its own strict, logical terms. In fact, a deeply committed utilitarian could read this entire story, watch Raskolnikov's total psychological disintegration, and stubbornly argue that the logic didn't fail at all. They'd probably claim it was merely a temperamental weakness in the man himself, not a failure of the evidence or the math. But that's the genius of it. Dostoevsky's true counterargument isn't logical, it's structural. The narrative violently forces you, the reader, to confront the bleeding remainder that the calculus systematically fails to see. You don't just read about Lizaveta's death as some statistical error on a spreadsheet. The story makes you feel the visceral horror of that unaccounted cost. The true force of the objection is found entirely in what the math willfully ignores.
Which leaves us with a lingering, provocative question to take away from this explainer today. Did the calculus actually fail, or is the human mind just not built to run the numbers? Is the math inherently flawed, or is the terrible weight of that arithmetic simply too heavy for a human soul to carry? It's a heavy question, and it's one Dostoevsky brilliantly forces us to answer for ourselves. Thanks for joining me on this one.